So once you have finished your first draft, once you get to the conclusion of the book, and remember that this is for the first draft, you're just trying to get words down on the paper and get the entire thing written. You're not going back and editing anything as you go. You're just kind of trying to get to the end. Once you got to the end of the story, I found this was a Stephen King tip, but if you put the draft away in a drawer for 6 weeks or so, when you come back to it, you're a little bit more objective. And so if you start reading your draft immediately after you finish it, you sort of see it more as what you intended to write rather than what's actually on the page. And over 6 weeks, you'll have forgotten a little bit the story and you'll be able to see it with fresh eyes and see more issues and problems and things that you want to change. During these 6 weeks, you can start working on another project if you want. If you really wanted to be super highly productive, you could write another book while you were aging the draft of your first book. So you could write a second book and have the second draft written when you came back to do revisions for your first. Revising is just a fancy word for reading it over and fixing things that you come across while you're reading it. So if you come across a sentence and the sentence just seems really awkward, this is when you rewrite it. If you come across a plot hole in your book, this is when you sort of fix the plot hole, add something kind of earlier in the book to sort of foreshadow it, or do something to make it seem like it was intended all along. Neil Gaiman has a line that I think is pretty good, that that your first draft is you telling the story to yourself, and your revision is when you make it sound like you knew what you were doing all along. And so that's the sort of thing that you're trying to do while you're revising. You're just trying to polish it up and make the whole thing read a lot smoother. There's some writers, P.G. Wodehouse is an example. He wrote the Jeeves and Wooster stories, that they agonize over everything they write, every word, every sentence. He said that basically before he published anything, every sentence he published would have been rewritten 12 times. And so at this point, it's almost like you're writing poetry, where you just agonize over the text and write and rewrite and improve and polish and just keep getting it as better and better as much as you can. Other writers will do a draft. Isaac Asimov is an example of this. Revise it very lightly, and then they move on to the next work. And so there's a story with Isaac Asimov that he would write a new book and he'd send it off and submit it to publishers. And sometimes they'd come back and they'd say, we'll accept this, but we want you to make these major revisions, these big changes to the book. And his response to that, his reaction would be, well, if I'm going to do all that work, I might as well just write a new book. And so he'd pull the book from that publisher and he'd resubmit it somewhere else. And he'd keep submitting the book until a publisher accepted it with more minor revisions, just because he wanted to move on to the next work. He didn't want to spend a lot of time writing and rewriting the same work. Neither of these is the right way to work when you're revising. If you're the type of person who just really works it over and just keeps improving it and polishing it and revising and revising and revising, that's great. If you're the kind of person who gets work out quickly, kind of gives it a light polish and then kind of puts it out the door and moves on to the next work, that's all right too. You're in good company, whichever of these approaches you follow. With editing, there's a lot of different levels of editing and types of editing. So when a writer says, I need to find an editor for my work, or I need to get my work edited, established writers will sort of scratch their head at that, because it can mean a lot of different things. And they oftentimes saying that somebody needs an editor is just sort of a disparaging comment from other writers. So it's a way of them saying that they don't think the writing's very good without saying that. So they'll just sort of say, oh, that person or that work needs an editor, or they need an editor for a newer writer. It is absolutely possible for things to get over edited. And this is, some indie authors will say this happens with traditionally published books these days, that it'll go through a publishing house and they have a staff of editors, and a group of people will each make some changes to the book. And by the time it gets into the reader's hands, it's been written by committee, and that it gets watered down by all the different people making changes to the story, and it loses its singular authorial vision. you know, some writers like Anne Rice were famously very opposed to editing, and so she wouldn't let anybody make big changes to her work, and she'd really argue with editors. And some people have said that her works would be much stronger if she had allowed them to be edited than what they are. But readers love her. She has a real fan group, and so she was able to maintain her singular voice in her books, and there were readers who wanted to read that. I mentioned about Isaac Asimov pushing back against editors and refusing large scale editing. You can get editing and proofreading done by friends, or you can hire people to do it. And it's not really a right or wrong thing. Obviously, your friends doing it will probably do it for you for free, or they'll do it really cheap. And probably professionals will have more experience, and maybe they'll do a better job. And so if you have the money for editing, wonderful. A lot of people have hired editors and had a really good experience and felt that it dramatically improved their work. And I even have heard from people who said that it made them better writers. The process of talking to an editor and revising their work, they kind of just learned how to write better. I've also seen where people have paid large amounts of money for editing, and what they've got back has been really poorly done. And I think now there's even scams where people will claim to be editors in developing countries, and they just get manuscripts and run it through ChatGPT or something like that, and then send it back to the person, and it looks like it's been edited, but they haven't done a very good job. So if you're going to hire somebody, like always, you want to be very careful to evaluate who you're hiring and whether or not they do a good job. I have typically, my wife has done all my editing for me. I've never hired an editor to edit my work. And some people might read my books and say, well, this guy should have hired an editor, but I'm really happy with the final product, and I'm really happy with to work with my wife on that. A developmental edit is the sort of most like all-encompassing and comprehensive edit. It considers the work as the whole. So the developmental editor will read the entire draft probably after you've revised it. They'll read your revised manuscript once you've made it as good as you can, and they will tell you the parts of the work that are stronger and the parts that are weaker, and they might suggest that you remove subplots. Some authors have talked about being told that they need to remove a character from a work, and that they have to then just go through and rewrite the whole story with that character removed. Sometimes they'll say that you really need to add something, so there's a subplot that you're going to need for the book, and you then might write an extra 20% of the book or something like that to kind of add things into it. This is the editing that I think really has a good chance of making you a stronger writer, because the developmental editor is really getting into the story and how the story flows and how it's put together with you, and they're really commenting on how you have written the story in ways that you could write it stronger. So if you really pay attention to the process, I think this gives you the best chance of really improving as a writer if you go through it. You get the problem that I talked about earlier, where somebody might come in as a developmental editor, and all they're going to do is sort of say, if I was writing it, this is how I would have written it. So I gave the example earlier where my urban fantasy, when I showed it to a friend who wrote romance, she wanted to turn it into really florid purple prose, overly verbose and lush writing. And that wasn't what I was trying to do. And she was just trying to turn it into the kind of book she would write, instead of understanding the kind of book I was writing and helping it be the best version of that book. And so that's really what you want for an editor, who understands what you're doing and makes your work as strong as it can possibly be, instead of trying to push you into creating a different work than what you wanted. Line editing is another type of editing, and this goes through your work on a line by line basis. So they're not really thinking about the structure of the work and the characters of the work and the parts of the work. They're not going to say you need a new subplot or anything like that, like a development editor would, but they'll just, for each sentence, polish up that sentence and make it the best possible sentence it could be. So it could be changing words, tightening things up if there was redundant parts of the sentence. And it's really a lot more tactical. You could think of developmental editing as strategic, and this is a lot more tactical. So going through and doing a fine-grained edit on every sentence as they work through through your story. Sensitivity editing is something fairly new, and like all of these, it's optional, but it's for when you as the author have a character in the book who is from a different group than you are, and you're worried about potentially offending that group. And so a sensitivity editing is somebody who's a part of that group reading your work and providing feedback about how you've represented the character that's a member of their group. And so nowadays, if a white European author was going to write a Western novel, they might want to have an Indigenous person read it over to comment on how the Indigenous characters in the book were portrayed. Most recently, I really like Naomi Novik's book, A Deadly Education. It's kind of like a harsher, more realistic version of Hogwarts. And in it, she had one passage where she sort of talked about dreadlocks as being a dangerous thing in this school because these kind of evil pest creatures would get into the hair and cause problems. And I've reproduced the paragraph down below. And people were quite upset. Some people were quite upset about how she wrote this, and she apologized and committed that in future versions of the book this paragraph was going to be removed, and that she'd hire sensitivity editors for editing for her future works. And so copy editing is just when they go through and fix grammatical and spelling errors. So they just read through the book and they fix every time they find a grammatical or spelling error. Sometimes it's funny because authors and editors butt heads on all these issues. Every time the editor suggests a change, some authors will really resist that and sort of say, I have it that way for a reason. And I, one point, saw a copy editor kind of complaining online, and she said that she was fixing the grammar for the person she was doing editing for, and he objected and said that she was robbing it of his voice. And she kind of said, well, she didn't say this, but she thought your voice is grammatically incorrect. And so she found that a real challenge, that the author wanted the book to be grammatically incorrect. Anytime a character speaking, if it's in quotation marks, that's fine. If there's grammatical errors and conceivably spelling errors in dialogue, because the character could be speaking in a way that's not grammatically correct. However, you do kind of want the text as a whole to be free of grammatical and spelling errors. Spell check and grammar check has gotten massively better in recent years, so a lot of people will just run this through a software, and then they'll fix any problems pointed out. Amazon actually, when you upload a book to them, they will flag things that it sees as grammar and spelling issues in the text as part of the process to uploading it. So they have software for this built in. And then I think most of us have friends who are really strong with grammar and spelling, and they could read over the book and pick out any problems for us and help us fix these. Proofreading is kind of the final editing. There's kind of another optional step, beta reading, that we'll talk about in a second. But proofreading is just where you go through and you ensure that the formatting's been done properly, that no sections of the text were dropped, that the page numbers appear, that chapters are titled consistently, and that it can sometimes include fact checking. So this could be considered a different type of editing where they check the facts. If you were doing probably like more of a nonfiction where you were asserting a number of facts, you might want somebody to just make sure everything that you're asserting in the book is actually true. And that could be a part of proofreading. And I actually had kind of this happen to me, that I got a book all set and it was ready, and I printed a copy of the book and I sent an author copy to a man I knew who was interested in it. And he sent me a message and he said, John, I hate to tell you this, but he said, your book doesn't have any page numbers. And so it was good that that was something with kind of like someone who was looking at a first release of the book, and it let me fix that before I could offer it for sale and kind of buyers could potentially be getting it.